going to restart everything. Alright, so here we go. Gotta be able to hear myself too. Okay, so today's show, I have a lot of content. I always feel like I'm not going to have enough to talk about. And then I have very much to talk about. So I do answer questions that are left on my Facebook page. I do not do call-ins at this time unless someone wants to come sit in the studio sometime and field those calls. But also, I do want to share because a lot of people have asked me, so I am going to be inviting in the candidates for local positions once we get closer to the election time. And I will need people in the studio with me, and so stay tuned for that. That'll be happening probably end of summer, fall, after we know exactly who is running for the elections. I will be doing city council and the mayoral race, so stay tuned for that. And if you do have an interest, I can give more information, but I'm always looking for people that can sit in the studio because I really would like to be able to take emails and calls, but it's a little bit hard to manage all those things at one time. So let's get started. You know, I keep saying that I cover a lot of not so great topics, but sometimes things have to be talked about. So today's show is on specifically the rise in school shootings. I have done a show on gun control, and I have done a show on mass shootings versus individual shootings. There are a couple things I'm going to touch on today that I covered in those, but I'm trying to cover, you know, school-specific information and really do an analysis. The reason that I'm doing this one is because I think that this is a really interesting kind of topic, specifically looking at school shootings and some of the reasons that we have a hard time addressing them, finding data about them, and so therefore you can't prevent them. If you don't know why they're happening, you can't really prevent them. So thank you for tuning in. If you're new to my show, and I know I get new viewers almost every show because people let me know, but it is a nonpartisan policy-based show. I ask, if you do ask questions or comment on the Facebook page, that you are respectful, and that your comments are respectful. If you have feedback for me, hit me with it. I got a thick skin. So, and then as always, you can always email me after. If you're on Facebook, you can private message me. But if you want to reach me via email for questions, you can do that at dg@maberme.com. All of my shows are, they live on Facebook, YouTube, and my website. And so you can look me up on YouTube. I'm pretty sure if you search for DOMENICA G, you'll find my YouTube page. And then my website is dominica.ninja. So those are kind of where they're living. I'm trying to do my best to get the 2 shows a month on my website within the month. But if you want to go back and watch the show on mass shootings versus individual shootings, or the one on gun control, please, I encourage you to go back and do that. And then we can have a conversation, because I always tell people that I don't have the answers, but I do want to spend the time doing the analysis. And this is, of course, my opinion and not that of PCA. So there you go, FCC. So anyway, let me start with, I wanted to start with a timeline of school shootings and data, but I read into something really interesting. First off, finding data specifically on school shootings is incredibly difficult. And there's this huge kind of hard thing to deal with where the CDC, and I learned this, in 1996, Congress prohibited the CDC from researching school shootings. I mean, that's not exactly how the process works, but basically the end result was that the CDC couldn't research the issue anymore specifically, and that I'm glad I found that fact, because I couldn't figure out why the CDC, I try to go to the source, where they're relatively held accountable for the the data points, and they're public, and I couldn't figure out why CDC, the last data set, ended in 1999, which isn't really current information, but there it is. So the CDC, and I believe it included other public health related agencies, cannot specifically study these areas. So there are private entities, they're usually nonprofits, but there are organizations that do research them. But what I found really quickly is that there's all these different definitions of what a school shooting is, what a mass shooting is. And so there was one article that really, and this is, my segue to don't just read the headlines ever. Like, you cannot read the headlines, because I saw one headline that said, school shootings aren't on the rise. That's not true. And of course I had to click on it. I'm like, okay, what is this person coming from? Well, first off, they were researching mass shootings. So that's killing four or more people at one time. So they weren't actually looking at all the school shootings. And I'm assuming it was just archival data collection, which is basically like looking back at all the data. And if these major agencies couldn't study it, where were they really coming from? And so they're really looking at mass shootings and different definitions, not necessarily explicitly about the school. So that's just my plug to say, you can't just read the headline. And when you can, it's going and kind of analyzing. And I do this a lot with papers that are released, because I always say, the results are reflective of who paid for the study. And so it's really important to kind of go in. In my opinion, I feel like whoever funded that study must have had a really strong interest in making it very clear that school shootings weren't on the rise, because honestly, I think it's like a flawed rationale. Like, why would you study that? Yeah, data points are great, but why would you pay for an entire study to try and show that school shootings aren't on the rise without giving proper definitions of what a school shooting is? Anyway, I'll get off my soapbox on that, but as I always say, please, please, please don't read the headline. Please, I always state my sources, and part of it's because I don't want it to sound like I made it up, and the other part of it is that, these agencies are held accountable to some extent, but if you're reading, and it's very easy to find data sets that are biased, if it's a blog, and they're not using, reliable data sources. I'm an academic. Using a blog or Wikipedia or any of those things were not considered reliable sources of data. So, and a lot of people now are getting their information from them, but there are plenty of blogs that do actually go through, state all their data, kind of give an overall analysis without it being super biased or one way or the other, and really preaching one way or the other. So I prefer those kind of blogs, because I like to be presented with the information and do my own analysis, and that's why I'm here. So, again, the data is very unclear, which makes my job very difficult. One of the big things is that this is for the National Center for Education Statistics. They show that violent crimes in general in schools have decreased, but given that information, there's been 23 school shootings so far in 2018, and what we're just about 6 months in. Actually, I think this data point wasn't up to this date, today. So relatively, that's quite a few. And I did want to go back in the years. This comes from Everytown for Gun Safety. Again, it's just so hard to know, but I'm going to share it anyway, because it's the best I can do. So in 2017, there were 64 school shootings. In 2016, there were 48. There were 63 in 2015, 58 in 2014, and 37 in 2013. Now, there are kind of an interesting shift, and I'm assuming that different things were going on at this time. I didn't want to look into every single data point too specifically, but basically, if you look at the difference between 2017 and 2013, you're talking about 64 shootings in 2017 and 37 in 2013. So there was a decrease in looking back, there was less in 2016, and then there was more in 2015. But then, as you go back in time, it went down. I couldn't find data for before 2013 that matched this data. It was weird. They had a full list of all the school shootings, but then there was only a few in 1 year. So, again, and I'm talking this data is about elementary and university level. So that's probably a different number than just looking at, elementary, high school. So this is all the way through university level. Part of that data was 68% of the guns that were used were from a family member. And that data is from the Secret Service. So, I think that they wouldn't fudge that around too much. So now I'm going to get into, and I actually, when I was doing the timeline, I wanted to start with Columbine, because for me, that was the first time that school shootings really became kind of on the forefront of consideration. Of course, there was crime during protests at universities, and there has been school shootings in the past. But I think when Columbine happened in 1999, it really kind of shook everyone to this idea that, someone would go into a high school and, have intention and do that. That was a significant mass shooting. That was a really significant mass shooting at a school. So, and, again, I thought that maybe some sort of timeline would be easier to put together, but it wasn't. So that is all right. So let's get into demographics, other data. It's not all demographics, but so 84 of the incidents between 2013 and 2015 happened in K through 12. Again, this is from Everytown for Gun Safety data. 76 in colleges, and of those shootings, half were committed with intention. Again, I think this is kind of they're premeditated. This can be a really hard thing to kind of assess, especially if the person also took their own life in the process. But that's, so that's basically, they had some premeditated plan to carry this out and carried it out. And then 1/6 of them occurred after verbal argument, and 93.5. Okay, so here's the one of the major demographics that I think stands alone, but 93.5% were male. 26.8% committed suicide. 15.6% killed more than one person. This information, again, is from the CDC from 1996 to 1999. I'm going to err on the side that is still relatively the same kind of data. And so you can see that if only 15.6% of all the school shootings killed more than one person, the researcher I was talking about prior that was only looking at the definition of mass shootings, which again is killing more than 4 people, and even that definition is not really agreed upon. People can't agree. If you're only looking at that data set, knowing that only 15.6% killed more than one person, you're missing something. You're missing something huge. So that study was ridiculous. I don't know how people, sometimes I don't know how scientists, these social scientists, have these things published and so adamantly believe when there's such a flawed logic, but it happens all the time. So I am going to get right into my analysis. There is some data mixed in here. I don't want to bog everyone down with data, but I also find it to apply specifically into different areas because this is such a broad issue. And I have a little bit of time, not that much time, so I have to integrate it as I go. So, and this is as I've said, I've thought about this a lot. As I said, I would consider myself an academic, and I have a background in public health and psychology. So I really think a lot about these issues from a cultural, societal standpoint to an individual standpoint. So this is something that I've thought about for quite some time. And really after the last few school shootings, I had to separate this out again because I did a show on individual versus mass shootings, which addresses part of the same data set, but only part of it, a small part of it. So I wanted to make sure to flesh this out. I don't want to talk about gun control because it's not a contributing factor, but because it's talked about so much and it's so polarizing. So I'm going to stray away from that. Again, I had a show on gun control, so you can go back and watch that one. I did want to review something I talked about in my mass shootings show because, and again, this gets integrated quite a bit, and I don't have all the statistics and all the information offhand from that show. When I'm distracted by my phone, it's because I'm making sure I can see what's going on. So there's this idea that maybe I can find it because I think it was really interesting that I learned something during all of my shows. But what I learned is that in the the DSM-5, which is the big book that helps doctors and psychiatrists diagnose mental health and illnesses, it changes constantly, like what they name things and what, certain spectrums are named or what, so it changes often. Well, when it changes, it's not every year. And I learned that psychopathy, which was always how I identified it, a very small percent of the population suffers from psychopathy. Actual psychopathy, which was its own diagnosis. So, but I learned that doctors use, they say, I don't want to mess it up, they call it, I think they call, so they say that it's an antisocial behavioral disorder, and that those disorders are spectrum disorders, which, sure, I know that this idea of spectrum disorders is important, and it is, especially with a lot of different ailments, but what I learned is that doctors are using this antisocial behavior diagnosis, which is this huge diagnosis, but scientists are still using psychopathy because it's a very specific set of characteristics, and they're very significant to someone that is on the other side of the spectrum. Antisocial behaviors can just be that you don't know how to, interact with groups of people where, and it gives you anxiety or whatever, there's a lot of options, to psychopathy where you literally don't understand and don't have a response to, for example, when psychopaths are studied, most of them are in jail, they actually do not have a mental, physiological, like a neurological reaction to like really nasty things, people getting killed, and those things that, other people in society, I don't like to say normal, but other people, we have a reaction. Like if we see someone get shot in front of us, that's a very trauma-inducing situation where people that have the true psychopathy diagnosis, they just don't have that response, which is why they are mostly in jail, because they commit crimes. They often commit violent crimes because they don't have that. It's like the severest antisocial behavior you can think of. So I did want to bring that back because I think that a huge issue with school shootings and shootings in general, but specifically in school shootings, and the messaging is changing a little bit, or it has been changing a little bit, because probably 5 years ago, I would remember that every time there was a school shooting, and they didn't happen as often, they'd basically, they'd interview someone and say, oh, well, half the time. Sometimes it was like, oh, he was weird, she was weird. And then the other half of the time was like, oh, they seem like such a normal kid. And people that commit shootings, again, I don't like to use the word normal, but they're not, there's something malfunctioning there. Let's just put it that way. And it's not necessarily a major mental illness, but again, there's some reason for this capacity to go and kill people with intent, with violent intent. And so without being able to identify those types of issues, and I'm gonna jump because I kind of sometimes I take my notes all out of order, but I'm gonna jump over to, hold on, let me get this. I don't think you guys can hear it because it's super quiet. Okay, so I'm actually gonna jump to the mental health statistics for teenagers and then a little bit of adults, because again, we don't fully have full data sets. So this is from the National Alliance on Mental Illness, NAMI. It's one of my, I like their organization quite a bit. Again, it's an unbiased kind of, relatively not political. They, of course, advocate for certain propositions and laws that help fund mental health services. But I think that this data is really prevalent, and I couldn't find an exact data point, but I think it's pretty well accepted that the occurrence of mental illness is increasing, especially in children. And again, there's, in medicine, it's always like, well, maybe people are getting diagnosed more, maybe, but based on the access to services, that doesn't line up. So let's go through this. So 20% of teens aged 13 to 18 have a mental illness. And this, presuming the data is from a diagnosed mental illness, because that's the best way to track it. And of those teenagers, and I think that these they have these great infographics on the NAMI website that you can probably order and print out if you want. If you just put if you Google, mental health data for children and NAMI, you'll find it. It'll come right up. So 37% of those teens drop out of school. 70% of juveniles in juvenile hall have mental illness, and I'll get to this in access to services, but I think that it's a two-pronged thing. Is that perhaps these kids had a mental illness which had them commit whatever the crime was to end up in juvenile hall, and now they're actually getting mental health services within juvenile hall that they didn't have access to before. If they had those services before, then it probably would have prevented them, not in all cases, but it could have prevented them from ending up in juvenile hall. So, so suicide is the third leading cause of death for ages 10 to 24. There's a lot of stuff going on in your body at that time, physiologically. So there's a lot of changes that, people have different things going on in their own neurology and physiology. So 1 in 5 adults have mental illness in the United States, and half of those have an onset at 14, and 3/4, including that half, have an onset by 24. So we're talking a good, 75% of people have the onset by age 24, and that's common when you talk about average onsets. It's not to say it's the rule, but then, if you know that half of these adults that now have mental illness, the onset was by 14, that would again suggest that if at 14 they had access to services, because they show that a lot of people don't access services, or they don't have access to services. So they're kind of just, left hanging in this process without the assistance they need from the time that they're young, preteen, teen, through adulthood. So, and our country doesn't believe in prevention right now. So I did not a whole show on that, but talked a lot about that too. There are 10.2 million people that have a dual diagnosis with a mental health issue and an addiction issue. The two go very close hand in hand. 26% are homeless that have mental illness, and 24% are incarcerated. So, and I did want to, again, I'm jumping between the youth and adult statistics because those adults were youth at one point. So depression is the number one, I didn't know this. Depression is the number one leading cause of disability worldwide. And then the cost of mental illness to the United States is $1.93 billion. And again, that statistic I think is brought up and significant because we don't believe in prevention and providing services. So something happens and it's way more expensive once something happens. And I don't want to get into big pharma and how all that costs and all that just glorious things. And I also would imagine that this number includes those who are incarcerated, who costs a lot of money to be incarcerated, and all the services. So anyway, $1.93 billion. I hope it includes loss of workforce and productivity too. Suicides are the 10th leading cause of death among adults in the United States. So let's go back. I think that's all the data I have to throw at you. Again, if you want to see it or, find out where it's at, I have it all written down. I don't know if you can see that, but I handwrite all my notes. It's just something I've done since I was in college, and people make fun of me, but I say I do it because the lines are distracting. They are. On lined paper. So there's a few, and I want to be very careful about how I describe these. I know this is a very emotional topic, and but at the same time, I think it's incredibly important to start assessing these options, having the conversations, getting a diverse set of people at the table, so we can have, these conversations in a very, diverse setting. Because I can talk about it from my point of view, but I'm not a physician. I am not a mental health provider. I'm not a school teacher. I'm not, any of these people. And I think that if all those people were able to come together, we'd have the answers. And there's no one answer. It's not a simple answer. So I really try to wrap my head around this idea of normalization of school shootings. And I don't believe in this case that they're copycat school shootings. I don't think that's a thing at all, because there's just so many contributing factors, again, for someone. It's not like a threat. It's people actually executing, which means that it's more of a copycat. But the question I ask myself all the time, is it becoming more prevalent? One of the reasons that it's becoming more prevalent is because it's just out there. It's out there. And is it that these students or ex-students or, whoever it is, some of them are out of domestic violence. Well, several of them are domestic violence related. Is it because now I feel like it's somewhat like, it's the same thing with like white supremacy. Like for a long time, people did it, under, and it's not to say that if these people didn't commit school shootings, they wouldn't commit some sort of other major crime at a different time. But I'm just wondering if it's making people feel like there's less repercussion, or there's more encouragement to do it. I don't like to execute it. That's what I mean, like not to do it. Again, I feel like there's these underlying mental health issues, and so I'm constantly trying to explain that even to myself, but there seems like there's some sort of, my guess would be that there's the media attention aspect, which, some people are looking for the drama of all of it. It's such a tragic situation, but perhaps some of these people think they're a martyr and they're doing what's right and they want people to see it and they want people. So there are those people too. I mean, it happens in all different types of major crimes. So I'm still trying to wrap my head around that one. But I think that there is an element of this just because how, especially in 2018, how we're seeing them back to back to back to back to back. So, what is it that people are, students and adults, because some of them were adults coming back, and we were talking about universities. What is going on where people think that it's just an okay thing to do now in increasing higher volume closer together, and what that looks like. So basically, there's also a lot of conversation now about conditioning. Because males that commit violence, because what did I say, like 93% of those, almost 94 if we round up, of those who commit these school shootings are men. So I think that that's like a really interesting thing to look at, is what's going on there. And again, there's a lot of conversation about that. Is the idea that men are more violent? I don't know. Is it that they are more likely to, pursue some sort of violent crime in order to solve whatever the issue was? I thought I had some data about how often it is due to a prior fight or disagreement that the school shootings happen. But that is a really, 1/6 are after a verbal argument. So that could potentially be one verbal argument and then the shooting occurring. So it just makes you wonder, like, what are the contributing factors that, all these men are, going and committing school shootings. And so that, again, that's kind of, I kind of wanted to start with the things that I'm still trying to wrap my head around, because it is a really complicated issue. I do think mental health and our lack of identification of mental health symptoms is a big part of it. So let me get back into kind of more of the areas that are in my arena of understanding from a public health perspective, and not strictly a mental health perspective. But we have seen a breakdown in culture and community over time in the United States. It's a very individualistic society, even though, you know, it's like you have your family and your focus, and we've kind of lost that tribal nature, which I always argue is human nature, is being tribal. No matter how large, how small your tribe is, you have that group of people. And, you know, that's how humans are, is we need our group and we need our support. It's not just you. It's not just your family. It's not just your group of 3 friends. It's this broader kind of support system. And data now shows that that is a contributor to overall wellness, is that community aspect. And how it's however you identify. It could be like a cultural community. It could be a religious setting. You know, it could be a spiritual community that's not, you know, it doesn't really matter what it is, but we're showing that, you know, there's a huge lack of community in this country. And I think that what that does is it's polarizing. And our media has really polarized people on either pole, and it's created fear. And so I think that lack of community and trying to, you know, separate people is a huge contributing factor to that. I guess it's like a lack of empathy. It's a lack of consideration for the outcome of your actions. And again, some of these people, when I was talking about psychopathy, some of these people are not going to be able to make that distinction regardless, but that's a very small minority. A very small minority have major mental illness, which is something like psychopathy. Most of them are suffering from other diseases. And that's, when I say major mental illness, that's how we define it. So it's not saying that other mental illnesses aren't important or aren't major, but it's just that's how certain illnesses are defined. To make the distinction, then there's like behavioral, you know, more social behavioral diagnoses too. So I think that it's this really interesting thing. I'm getting comfortable. I looked a lot at this in my undergrad and then in my graduate school. And I've talked about it in other show that we have this really interesting thing going on. And I think that I am a product of I lived during the generation that I feel like this really hit home with. And it's this idea that every single one of us is special, and that every one of us can be whatever you want. And that's kind of what we're fed through school. And it's not to say that we shouldn't tell kids that they're not special, and they're really, for me, it's more like we should be telling kids that they can be themselves instead of saying that they're special or, you know, they're somehow elevated, because it's interesting because we're using language that says you're all special, but then that actually like doesn't have as much meaning, because if everyone's special, then you're not really identifying yourself as an individual. So it's not about, you know, making that mass just thing. And then, but the interesting thing about that is I think kind of the inverse that happens is that kids go into school and they think, and again, they go in with, and this really hits you when you go to college, man, hard. So this isn't necessarily they start school when they're 5. But I think very rapidly there's definitely people that already have a really low level of self-esteem. But then I think when we're teaching children to not be able to identify with who they are, and again, just putting this mask, like everyone's special and everyone can do what they want and everything. And again, it's not to say that you shouldn't encourage your children to do what they want, but give them the tools to accomplish that. You know, like I kind of cringe a little bit when I, you know, hear this whole rhetoric that, you know, and again, it's just a languaging thing. I don't think that people's intention are there, but it's give people the tools and the opportunities to do better. Like, that's the key. Like, if you don't have the opportunity to, you know, address your mental health illness or, you know, talk to someone about your conflict resolution skills, and if that is mental illness, or if you just can't, you don't understand conflict resolution, or, you know, one of them, it's this, you know, male toxicity kind of idea that, because it came out because the last school shooting, and again, we know domestic violence is a huge piece of shootings in general that happen, and it's often relayed, but we found out after the last shooting that the girl, I guess, he was like stalking her. Correct me if I'm wrong. For me, it's like I don't like to look into all the details because it occurred and we have a broader issue, so I don't want to get hung up on each individual case. But to my point about domestic violence, they showed that he was basically stalking her and that she had turned him down several times. And so that was why she was one of the targets. And so again, when there's a premeditated kind of situation, there's more of a clear cause of why this happened. Again, it's not speaking to why he had the capacity to shoot someone. And he did get the weapon from home, if I remember correctly. I think it was his dad's or his uncle's, one of those. And so there's this idea of this entitlement and a very long, and I talk about it in my show about feminism. I've talked about it in my show called The XX Problem. And it's this idea that we have given women equal rights in a lot of ways, but that deep cultural dynamic is still there where men feel entitled to see a woman, be with a woman, and they're like, you're mine now, and I'm gonna keep, I'm gonna keep poking at you. And it's like that whole thing about, don't tell your little girls that a boy's hurting you because he is flirting with you. That's ridiculous. That's enabling that kind of behavior in a little boy, and the little boy doesn't know any better. He might think in his mind like he's bothering her because he wants her attention, but telling little girls that and, reinforcing that culture that, oh, boys are gonna, trip you because they're flirting with you. Like, how messed up is that in your head? Like, that's just not okay. And that's perpetuating this culture that boys kind of have this leeway to do whatever they want to get a woman, a girl, a woman. And I experience it every day. You go out and guys are so aggressive. Like, they're really, really aggressive. And it's not always, like, in a bad way. I'm not saying it's, they're being aggressive in a lot of ways. But they are really way more direct. And in general, again, I'm not trying to say all men. But I think if you look at the stats and you hear a lot of TED Talks and you'd see that is a common thing. And they are really persistent. And it gets obnoxious, and I've actually felt in physical danger before because someone was so constantly. I had a stalker in high school, and then I luckily had a good sized group of guy friends that stopped that. They didn't do anything physical. They just said stop talking to her. It was enough. But it is this kind of idea where it's this overbearing kind of like idea that even when you tell them, no, this isn't a thing, they just keep persisting. It's like, no, it's not a thing. And so there's an issue with that because if someone tells you, no, I don't want to date you, and then you're still like really aggressively pursuing them, and that's kind of what happened in this case, is this boy was stalking her. And she kept just saying, no, like, I'm telling you, I don't want to be with you. And he just, like, couldn't even handle that. So there's a lot of talk about that. And we know that's an underlying culture in our society and that's, I always go back to Brock Turner because everyone knows that case and everyone knows what happened. And then they saw his sentence. He got sent. I mean, thank God Stanford kicked him out because that was his worst sentence. What the judge gave him was ridiculous. What was it? It was like 18 months in jail, I think, for raping someone. Like, we've set this, especially for white men. I should say white men. And a majority of the mass shootings, as I said in that show, are white men that do them. But so I should make that distinction because, as we know, as I know, as we should know, African Americans experience a much higher rate of incarceration than white men. So, but it just goes to show that. So now it's okay to physically assault a woman in a pretty grotesque way. And then you only have to go to jail for 18 months. And people were protecting him. They're like, oh, well, he's a good kid, and he's an athlete, and he's a star to the school. And it's just like, now you're justifying kind of behavior. And that goes on every day, all the time. Sometimes it's really subtle and unintentional. And then sometimes it's really blatant, where there was a Facebook page that they finally took down that basically said that Brock Turner was wrongfully identified and that because he was an athlete and a good kid that somehow he should have been exempt. And to be frank, his parents had a lot of money. So he was able to have a top-notch lawyer that got him out of doing any real time for what he did. And so, again, we're just setting this precedent. And don't you think there was high school boys and, and again, it's throughout all ages. And again, maybe when you're younger, you're told that, poking a girl is flirting. all the way up to sexually assaulting a woman is okay because you're a white athlete at Stanford. So I do think that that's a very valid issue, is kind of that male cultural toxicity and conditioning that that's just okay behavior. And again, it starts at a really young age. I mean, again, it's a very complicated issue, but and it's not to say that girls don't sometimes mess with boys too. Again, nothing's a rule, but I think it is something that should really be looked into. Again, it's like I can hear people in my head. It's a polarizing issue because men get all defensive. Then there's the women that that are like, oh no, it's not like that. But that it's got to be talked about. The data's there. The culture's there. We know that domestic violence is linked to most all these shootings that are done. So it's got to be looked at. So again, I went on a tangent. I do that often, but basically I went from, the idea that everyone is entitled and special to certain things, which again, it varies with race, ethnicity, location. I'm not taking away from that. All the way to, it's just, and that's kind of comes back to the normalization. Like, this is just an okay reaction to a girl turning me down. And yeah, like, it just, anyway, so let's get off that before I keep ranting, because I'm already almost out of time, because we had a few minutes of technical difficulty. So, and then the other side with the male, what is it called? It has a name. I'm calling it male toxicity, but there's some, like, male toxic culture or something like that. But I also think the media is playing a big piece in this, as I think the media is playing a big piece in a lot of things. And again, I really think, and these issues have been made political, and that has a lot to do with our societal polarization and how the media polarizes everyone. It's not a political issue. None of this is a political issue. That's why I'm covering it on my show. This isn't a Republican-Democrat issue. This isn't a conservative liberal issue. This is an issue. And unfortunately, and that's why I didn't want to talk about gun control today, because people are so far on either side of that spectrum that, I don't really want to get super into it, because when you have a school shooting, the automatic thing is gun control. Yes, that is an issue that probably does need to be addressed. That is an issue that needs to be addressed. But it's not the only issue. And I feel like avoiding all these other issues that are very complex, gun control, and I'm not saying it's going to happen with the current administration, but gun control is a law. Dealing with long-term mental illness and lack of services and lack of access, that is a very huge issue. And culture and changing the culture of domestic violence and all these kind of things, like, those are the major issues that need to be addressed now. And again, I'm not saying that gun control shouldn't be a priority. It is a priority, but these really deep-rooted issues that infiltrate all different areas of life. It's not just shootings. It's not just violence. This is, every day having to go out as a woman and deal with certain circumstances. And again, and there's a lot of men that live in fear. I think I did in my my mass shooting show, it's such a terrible way to name it, but that's what it was about. I think it was like 90% of Black men in Washington, D.C. expect to be incarcerated, just because it's just so common, that incarceration. And I recommend going back to that show if you haven't seen it or listened to it after this one, because I think it actually gives a lot of good base information that I'm not going over right now. And a lot of data and a lot of my analysis of why mass shootings occur. So I'm not reiterating it here, but so I recommend that. It's called Mass Shootings versus Individual Shootings, and it goes a lot into like trauma and community-based trauma and PTSD and stuff like that. So I already talked about entitlement, the toxic media. I don't want to, beat that down, because I talk about it pretty much in every show. Everything being politicized as opposed to being talked about as an issue. And unfortunately, in our current system, that's how it's been working, is that every issue, every law is a political one. It's a Republican issue, it's a Democratic issue. People need to start working across the aisle, and I know it's such a thing to say, like, it seems like I'm saying it in vain, but you have to start working across the aisle. And I think that that's what the major thing right now is, getting people as much as possible currently working across the aisle, and then the individual states can deal with these things too. So pushing we just had an election today, right? Yeah, today. If you haven't voted yet, I think the polling places are still open until 7 or 8 in California. Oh, it's already almost 8. I lost my train of thought. But so the state level can also control a lot of things. And so I want to go back to kind of my closing statements. And I didn't mention this, but I also think there's kind of a lack or a decrease in parental involvement in a lot of students' lives. And, that's a big issue in it, because if you don't have parents, like, oh God, I always joke that you shouldn't have to write things down because it seems intuitive to me, but then I realize it's not intuitive. They have the commercials in the state of California about reading and talking to your child, and it kind of blew my mind that had to be said. I understand that not everyone quite understands, like, reading to your children. They really, really learn a lot, and they learn about language. But even just having to tell people to talk to their child, their baby, like, we're talking little kids, like babies before they're really auditory. And I was just kind of shocked. But it goes to show that it's not just lack of parental involvement in schools, it's this lack of, like, even sort of involvement in your child's life whatsoever. Family planning plug. Hello. And this is, I don't know why the stats there, but 50% of youth 8 to 15 don't receive treatment. So again, and you can see how this would then perpetuate over time once they become an adult. And if half the onset of mental illness is by age 14, this is like right during the onset where they're not receiving services. And again, they should really be receiving services before, when things are just starting. I feel like when the onset's at 14, they're already displaying some pretty significant symptoms. Again, I'm not a doctor. And then Black and Hispanic Latino people access services at half that rate. And there's a lot of reasons for that. So, basically, and again, I had to go over this so quickly because there's just so many aspects to it. But what I really wanted to talk about is at a very local level, because I like to bring this back, is that a bunch of mental health services just got defunded, and these services are already not funded well. And again, I hope people voted today all across the country, because a lot of these people got to go. And I did a show on it. I'm pretty sure, I haven't entirely researched it, but I did a show on this law that was in the process of being passed. And even if it wasn't this specific one, there's a lot that mirrored it, where they were taking services away from prevention programs and putting them towards clinical services, which isn't a bad thing. We need money for both of those things. But again, it's taking away from prevention and identification and putting it to direct care services, which pharma and, all these other agencies are pushing and lobbying for because they make money if people are sick. If people aren't sick, then these big pharma, for-profit hospitals, they don't make money. And so by getting rid of all these prevention services, and so what's happened at a local level, dang, I should have found that there's an article about it. I think it's, the county of Sonoma is having to eliminate, it was almost 100, 75 to 100 unfilled and positions that they wanted to have filled due to the cuts. And then I think it said about 35 people are potentially going to lose their job over these lack of prevention services and then lack of mental health services. And it's causing a scurry of issue because there isn't enough access to even private mental health service providers. I go to Kaiser, and they talk about all the time, we literally just don't have enough providers to work with all these people. Because, again, these rates have gone up so much. And I know that there's a huge, I worked with it was mainly MFTs and social workers, but they did a lot of counseling with youth. And the biggest issue there, and it's the same with school teachers, is that there aren't enough people in color in those positions so that they can serve other people of color, and that's shown to be a really effective thing. It's not to say, Like, I won't go to a mental health provider that is a man, and that's my own decision, but that's what I'm comfortable with. So if there was way less women in, you know, the mental health arena, then I would have a way more limited access to what I'm comfortable with. So, and there's a lot of vulnerability that goes with that. So that's a huge issue to access. And so now access, it was already bad, and now access is being limited once again. So this is only going to perpetuate the issue going forward. And honestly, I don't understand. It's probably because I am in public health, but I don't understand in a million years why anyone could rationalize this behavior. But I do think it's a control thing for the government. I think that they try to show that they're saving money when they're not actually saving money. It's about pushing the money in other places because, you know, poor people and, you know, I hate saying lower socioeconomic status. It's such a scientific, like, they're poor people. They have lower opportunity. They have less opportunities, and they have less access to care, preventative, direct care services. So not only will, you know, like I said, Black and Hispanic Latino people pursue mental health services at half the rate of youth across the board. So there's all these factors, and, you know, unfortunately mental health, because of it being stigmatized, I don't even talk about that. I talk a lot about that in another show too. But because it's so stigmatized, and because people kind of put it on a back burner because they can't access services everywhere, there's a lack of, it's not just lack of access, it's, you know, lack of accessing if there are services available. And again, I think that, you know, a lot of these school shootings aren't, the data shows they're not poor people of color, which is who we like to blame mass shootings and individual shootings and all these crimes on, which, again, that's putting it very brashly, but that's like, I don't know, well, I know many people that disagree with me, but they don't tend to be on the other end of this filming thing, or the other end of the streams. So without services and without people being able to identify warning signs, and NAMI also has this whole thing on warning signs for mental illness, and I know teachers are already bogged down, and I'm not claiming it's teachers' jobs, but it would be helpful if they do. I know there's a lot of like trauma-informed care training going on in schools now, but if they kind of could learn to identify some of the signs. But then I did a show on mental health in a high school classroom. Again, it's a great show. It's like, I think it was my second show ever. It's on my website. And the students were talking about how they only had one counselor, and she literally didn't have the time to work with all the students that wanted to access her services. So again, this is just a huge issue. Like, why don't we have more school counselors on campus? Because there's no money for it. So, I think that's pretty much it, because I have like 2 minutes left, 2.5 minutes left. So I just wanted to reiterate, I definitely want to keep having this conversation. I really want to bring people into the studio to interview. So if you're ever going through any of my shows, or you hear a show where you either know someone or you're interested in coming on for an interview, I am always really happy to have people here. Like I said, if you want to be in the studio off screen, helping me look stuff up or field questions, that's also great. I'm especially going to need that when I start interviewing the candidates for local positions. Please, please, please start recruiting my friends at that point. I'm going to need someone in the studio. And my overall, ending comment is, don't just read the headline, because it's very misleading. And we're dealing with a lot of serious issues in our country right now. And people don't really do their due diligence. And, don't post it all. If you don't want to look past the headline, just don't post it at all. So I will be back on in 2 weeks from today. I think it might be... Nope. I'll be here. If you have any ideas of topics or shows you'd like to hear, always let me know. I do get a lot of feedback from my friends, but I would like to broaden that feedback to just issues that you want me to talk about. Like I said, you want to come in, talk about it. You know people that want to come in, talk about it. Again, my show is nonpartisan. I try to stick to the policy. My opinion obviously peeks out sometimes, but it's really important to me that it be nonpartisan. So I am going to sign out now, and thank you so much for joining me, and I hope that you join me next time too.